The content in this video is compiled by us from many sources as well as contributions from the community. If there are any errors, please comment below. We will fix and change. Long before we learned to write, we remembered through rhythm. The way water moved, how ash stuck to the skin, the scent of a wounded animal nearby. These were the first kinds of knowledge. There was no calendar, no concept of a future waiting to be filled. There was only weather, hunger, and the responsibility to notice. Every small decision, where to step, when to move, who to trust, held the weight of life or death. In that world, people weren't defined by what they owned or produced. They were defined by their ability to stay aware, to listen, to feel the shift in the wind. For thousands of years, this was the human condition. Not one of luxury, but of clarity. There were no distractions. Survival didn't allow them. What seems distant to us now, gathering wood with bare hands, learning the sky by memory, recognizing an animal by the shape of its tracks, was once the fabric of everyday life. Not exotic, not primitive, just ordinary. We call them prehistoric, as if their lives were just a rough draft, but in their time they weren't waiting for us. They were fully themselves, raising children, sharing food, tending wounds, grieving loss. They weren't simple and they weren't wild. They were just human, with no instruction manual and no second chances. Today, we navigate a world that often feels too fast, too loud, too synthetic. We outsource memory. We ignore fatigue. We forget that the nervous system we depend on wasn't designed for meetings, traffic, or social media. It was shaped by silence, by sudden movement, by the constant awareness of something larger than us. Something that could either feed us or end us. We often imagine the past as something we've moved beyond. We say things like, they lived simple lives, as if simplicity means emptiness, as if the absence of technology was the absence of thought. But when you strip away modern convenience, you don't remove complexity, you remove noise. In ancient life, nothing was easy and nothing was mindless. Each moment required attention. Walking alone too far could get you killed. Eating the wrong plant could silence your entire bloodline. There were no small choices. These were not people drifting through a slow-motion version of our lives. They were constantly calculating, not with numbers, but with instinct sharpened by consequence. Where is the water source? Are there signs of large animals nearby? Has that silence in the trees lasted too long? They didn't have smartphones, but they could read the earth. They didn't have clocks, but they understood the sky. Modern humans often confuse fast with smart. But a quick answer isn't always a wise one. Our ancestors knew when to stop. They understood waiting. They understood watching. And they weren't rushing to fill silence with noise. They sat still and listened for signs that weren't written down. Changes in wind, cracks in the ice, the pattern of bird calls. None of it could be Googled, but all of it mattered. We say they were primitive because they lacked machines, but what they had was focus, a kind of full-body awareness we've almost forgotten how to access. When you live in a place where one bad decision can end your story, you learn to pay attention to the right things. And ignore the rest. They weren't distracted. They couldn't afford to be. You might assume that without written records, they lacked understanding. But language is only one form of memory. They pass down knowledge through rhythm, gesture, proximity. A mother showing her daughter how to bind a wound wasn't just teaching first aid. She was preserving the survival of the group. These moments didn't look dramatic. They didn't need to be. What mattered was that they worked. Every day was a kind of quiet rehearsal for something that might go wrong, and when it did, they responded fast, because they had trained for it in silence. Imagine a culture where wisdom wasn't written but lived, where teaching wasn't institutional but relational. Not this is how to do it, but watch me, then try. There's nothing simple about a world where nothing is guaranteed. where shelter is rebuilt after every storm and food is earned, not stored, where conflict resolution might involve leaving forever. And where there are no laws but consequences are swift, still they found ways to stay close, to grieve, to share what little they had, to celebrate things that had no language, a child's first steps, a healed wound. Rain after a dry season. This wasn't simplicity, it was a different kind of richness, one built not on things but on patterns, on presence, and on patience, if you lived like that, paying attention to nothing but what your body, your group, and your land were telling you. Would you call it simple? Or would you call it something else entirely? They didn't have more time than we do. They just used it differently, because every hour was paid for in sweat, in hunger, and in care, and every relationship might be the only thing between you and death. We inherited their bones. Their nervous systems, their capacity for love, for caution, for endurance, and whether we know it or not. We also inherited their attention. Hunting wasn't just a way to eat, it was a way to listen. Before the sprint, before the strike, there was stillness. Not the kind we know in waiting rooms or traffic jams, but the stillness of a body merging with landscape. You had to disappear before you could act. You had to become the forest, or the grass, or the silence between two heartbeats. There was no glory in rushing. The deer wasn't impressed by courage. It was startled by carelessness. A breath too loud, a twig misplaced, a rhythm that didn't belong. Predators in the wild don't make noise, they don't speak. They don't think out loud, they observe, they align, and then when the time is right, they move. This is what hunting really required. Not brute strength, but humility. The humility to go unnoticed, to listen for things smaller than thought. The most experienced hunters weren't the loudest. They weren't even the ones who always landed the final blow. They were the ones who read the earth like a memory. They could spot the break in a trail that meant something had passed, not long ago, but not just now. They could tell when a clearing was wrong, too quiet, too open, too fresh. This was their intelligence, not abstract reasoning or mental calculation, but pattern recognition at its purest, noticing the shape of absence, noticing the shift in birdsong or the tilt of dust in sunlight, noticing what had changed since the last time they passed this way. These skills weren't optional, they were survival. And they didn't hunt alone. A successful hunt required trust, not just in strength, but in silence. Everyone needed to know their place, their role, their distance. The youngest moved the most. The oldest often waited in shadow. Even the one who never touched the kill was part of the hunt. By watching the wind, by drawing prey toward a bottleneck, by stepping where they were told to step. To hunt was to belong, to be entrusted with danger, to carry your body like a question the world hadn't yet answered, and to accept that today might not end with meat. But it would end with memory, and with that, experience. They didn't measure success by the kill alone. Sometimes, the greatest reward was learning where the prey had gone, or learning that you'd been seen before you were ready, and asking why. Failure wasn't just possible, it was expected. No one succeeded every day, no one hit the mark every time, but each failure carried a lesson that wasn't forgotten, because forgetting was dangerous. Children were taught not how to hit, but how to wait, not how to run fast, but how to follow without being noticed. Patience was more prized than aim. This way of moving through the world leaves an imprint. Even now, in cities and offices, some part of us still tenses in silence, still scans the edges of a room, still feels more alive when moving through shadow, unnoticed. Still carries the echo of that old, patient hunt. We don't hunt the same way, but our nervous systems remember what it meant to track, to stalk, to wait, to act only when the timing was right, and when it wasn't. To remain still. The modern world rarely rewards this way of knowing. It pushes for urgency, for noise, for reaction. But not long ago, what kept you alive wasn't speed, it was silence. It was the willingness to feel your surroundings before you touched them. To become a shape the world wouldn't notice. Until it was already too late. They didn't live in one kind of world. The conditions shifted constantly, between cold and heat, between wide plains and dark forests, between safety and threat. Each terrain came with its own rules. And they learned those rules not from books, but by living close to the edge of what the land allowed. Movement wasn't a choice, it was built into survival. When the rivers dried up or the animals vanished, the group didn't debate. They gathered what they could carry and started again. Homes were never permanent. Every camp was temporary until something made it unlivable. Food shaped everything, where it was found, how far it moved, and when it returned. The land didn't provide evenly. In some regions there was fruit, honey, small prey. In others, only bones and bark. They didn't complain, they adapted. If animals became harder to catch, they shifted to digging, to trapping, to watching the birds more closely. What grew underfoot mattered just as much as what ran through the trees. They built nothing large, no walls, no fences, no gates. What they had was carried or left behind. The idea of ownership looked different. A sharp stone belonged to whoever sharpened it. A path belonged to no one. They remembered by marking, scratches on bone, handprints on stone, grooves where tools had rested too many times. Nothing was permanent, but nothing was meaningless. The climate they faced changed faster than we assume. Winters grew long without warning. Floods erased familiar paths. Storms forced them to abandon dry land for higher ground. No one made charts. They adjusted by paying attention to the color of the sky, the smell of the wind, the way animals moved earlier than usual. They didn't call it knowledge, but they carried it in how they moved. Rest wasn't a destination. It happened when conditions allowed. If they found shelter, they stayed. If they didn't, they kept walking. There was no schedule, only opportunity. The land gave space for sleep when it could. When it didn't, they slept lightly or not at all. They weren't tourists in nature. They were participants. Their footsteps shaped the soil. Their choices altered the patterns of birds, the paths of deer, the growth of trees near the camp, but they didn't dominate. They responded. What was left behind was rarely waste. Bones were tools. Ashes were spread. Even broken objects were used to teach the young. Each place left a mark, not just on the body, but on memory. A dry valley meant exhaustion. A grove full of berries became a story. A hill where someone died turned into a quiet threshold no one crossed without acknowledgement. The landscape didn't need names to matter. It mattered because they had bled there, laughed there, returned there. We often imagine our ancestors as wandering blindly, but they knew their world far better than we know ours, not through maps or numbers, but through texture, smell, and memory that lived in the soles of their feet. Everywhere they went, they remembered where they'd been, and they carried those places with them, across valleys, rivers, and time. Hunting didn't begin with the chase. It began with knowing where to look. The people who left camp at first light had no map, only memory. They carried the habits of animals in their minds, not just where they slept, but how they moved after storms, where they drank when the sun shifted, how long it took them to forget the scent of humans. They weren't always tracking. Some days they were learning, revisiting familiar ground to see what had changed. When the trail was fresh, they could follow it. When it wasn't, they still brought something back, an update, a warning, a possibility. They rarely spoke. Every sound had a cost. They relied on gesture and rhythm instead. They carried different tools, depending on what they expected to find. Some brought spears. Others carried slings, digging sticks, or thin cords used for traps. If they found game, they adapted. If not, they gathered what the land offered: roots, eggs, insects, bark. This wasn't improvisation. It was competence built through repetition. The more they observed, the less they needed to guess. Gathering required its own kind of discipline. Plants could deceive. Some looked useful but sickened the body. Others healed but had to be cut at the right time. Knowledge came from watching how animals ate, from years of trial and error, and from the memory of who got sick and who didn't. Often, this knowledge lived in the older members of the group. They didn't run anymore, but they remembered. Children didn't gather for entertainment. They carried small bundles. They were taught where not to step, what to leave alone, how to lift a rock without disturbing a nest. These lessons weren't delivered as rules. They were demonstrated. If a child failed, it wasn't punished. It was explained, wordlessly sometimes, but clearly. Sometimes a gathering group and a hunting group would cross paths. They might trade what they'd found or pass along what they'd seen, a track, a carcass, a sign of something larger nearby. These were moments of coordination, not celebration. Each person had a role, and the roles shifted by season, by age, by what the land allowed. A good day didn't mean success for all. The group shared what was available. A single animal, when brought down, could feed many. But so could a day of quiet collection, nuts, roots, birds, eggs, honey drawn slowly from inside a fallen tree. Time was spent carefully. Energy was measured. There were no extra trips. No one worked alone unless they had to. Even those gathering far from camp returned before dark, not for safety alone, but to keep the rhythm. Dinner was built together. Fire was fed together. The day closed only when everyone returned. Hunting and gathering weren't separate jobs. They were extensions of the same mindset. Pay attention, stay useful, carry your part without being asked. Tomorrow someone else would walk that path. The animals would move again. New plants would bloom. What worked today might fail the next. That was never seen as failure. It was part of the exchange. They gave time. The land gave something back when it was ready. The middle of the day brought a different rhythm. Urgency gave way to steadiness. The hunt was already in motion. Firewood had been gathered. Water had been drawn. What remained belonged to the work of keeping life intact: tools, wounds, bonds. Some knelt beside stone slabs, sharpening edges that had dulled. Others examined cords and slings, checking for frays. A few reinforced frames with new branches or tightened joints where joints had weakened. None of it was rushed. Each task made sense in the context of the day, and each pair of hands found something to repair. Children didn't sit on the edge of things. They moved between people, picking up fragments of labor. One brought a broken basket to an older woman and waited, watching her hands. She nodded and he sat, attempting the same weave with a new strand. There was no ceremony in it. The learning lived in repetition and attention. Leadership shifted with the task. In the morning, the man who knew the tracks best had spoken. Now, it was the woman who treated wounds whose hands others deferred to. Tomorrow, it might be someone else. There was no permanent hierarchy. Usefulness rotated. Influence was a temporary shape. Pain wasn't hidden, but it wasn't highlighted. A man with a strained ankle sat with his leg stretched out, wrapping it slowly. Another came by, said nothing, and handed him a bundle of cloth. No eyes turned toward them. But everyone noticed. Rest happened between motions. A woman leaned back while a pot simmered beside her. A child slept against her chest. Another woman stirred a thick paste nearby. There was no pressure to be efficient. Time was not being measured. The midday heat pulled the group into shade. People clustered beneath trees and overhangs. Conversations dropped to whispers or gestures. Even silence had weight. Connection didn't rely on words. Play and instruction blurred together. A group of children balanced on a log while an adult nearby reshaped a spear tip. He didn't speak, but his eyes tracked their steps. They weren't wasting time. Their games were practice. Knowledge didn't pass through explanation. It passed through presence. Teenagers sat close to the adults working on a hide. No one told them to be there. No one explained what to do. They learned by staying close enough to feel the rhythm of movement. Status was fluid. What held the group together wasn't ritual, wasn't threat. It was knowing who knew what and honoring that. Even someone who wasn't strong might be the only one who knew how to shape a bow or calm a baby. Contribution came in many forms. Midday wasn't idle, but it was soft. Time expanded slightly between gestures. Hands didn't hurry. Eyes lingered. People took up the spaces between action and waiting without needing to fill them. Toward afternoon, the air began to shift. One person stood, looked toward the trees. Another listened. The others noticed, not with alarm, but readiness. Movement might be returning. News might arrive. The sound of branches breaking in the distance meant something was coming. Until then, they remained where they were, working, pausing, remembering. And in that quiet hour, they practiced the most important skill of all: to stay close and let the presence of others shape what came next. Before the world had words, it had rhythm, a heartbeat, a breath, a sudden stillness. These were not accidents of the body. They were the first grammar. Communication began not in the throat, but in the muscles, the eyes, the space between gestures. Imagine a world with no vowels, no syntax. A world where a mother's narrowed eyes could halt a child in motion, where a hand resting on a stone could say, "Wait, danger." Before language was ever carved into sound, it was shaped by movement. It had weight, intention, and above all, presence. Survival demanded this fluency. In the open plains or deep forests, words were slow. The body responded faster. The tensing of shoulders at the scent of smoke. The low hum passed between women weaving baskets, syncing their pace. These weren't conversations. They were symphonies of shared awareness. Children were not taught, they watched. A boy didn't learn that the sky meant rain. He learned to look at his father's face when the wind changed, to notice the silence of birds. Comprehension came before classification. Before he ever said storm, he knew to build shelter. In the absence of written instruction, memory lived in the body. A gesture paired with a sound could trace the path of migrating animals. The angle of a knee bend, the curve of a hand, the beat of a drum at twilight, each carried meaning. Precision wasn't in vocabulary, it was in timing. When words finally formed, they didn't replace what came before. They amplified it, the hum of voice layered over gesture. A sentence became more than sound, it became performance. To speak was to move, to signal, to become visible in intention. But even before speech, humans found ways to leave echoes. Symbols weren't born from abstraction, but necessity. A spiral scratched into rock wasn't decorative, it was instruction, a warning, a memory etched in permanence. In a darkened cave, fingers dipped in ochre pressed against stone. The result, a handprint, the message: I existed, I witnessed, I pass this on. Dance became archive, not celebration, but education. Each step echoed stories no one could write. The movement taught what was safe to eat, when to cross rivers, how to mourn. The tribe didn't need history books. They danced their past into the present. Emotion, too, had choreography. Grief made the body heavy. Laughter made it loose. Reconciliation was not spoken. It was offered in silence, a hand on the shoulder. The act of sitting beside someone without demand. Even in conflict, language was physical. Turning your back was dismissal. A sideways glance might invite challenge. Stillness could end a quarrel without a single word. Love, perhaps most of all, was pre-verbal. It lived in the softness of a hand placed on a sleeping child's chest, in the shared tasks of daily life, in the quiet glance across a fire. And when the tongue learned to speak, the body did not stop. We still lean forward when we care. We still know when someone's silence is loud. The legacy of those wordless days lives in our instincts. Today, we think of language as grammar and dictionaries, but beneath every utterance is a foundation built from gesture, breath, rhythm. We punctuate our texts with emojis, trying to resurrect the tone that once required no explanation. In every culture, even the most modern, there are remnants of this embodied speech. The bow in Japan, the hand over the heart in the Middle East, the shrug, the nod. These are not habits, they are inheritances. Our ancestors didn't lack language. They built it with their hands, their feet, their silence. They passed it down not in books, but in breath. The first language wasn't heard, it was seen, it was felt, it was remembered. Before the first prayer was whispered, grief had already carved its altar. It may have begun with a still body, a hunter who did not return, a child whose cry never came again. Long before we had gods to explain death or afterlives to soften it, there was only absence and the silence that fell in its wake. The tribe gathered, not to speak but to be near. Death didn't ask for language, it asked for presence. A hand laid gently on the chest of the dead. A quiet vigil, no words, only breath and sometimes tears. Over time, absence was met with ritual, stones arranged in careful patterns, feathers tied to trees, bone charms placed near burial sites, not because they understood what came after, but because remembering felt necessary. Love, too, arrived without language. It was seen in the way a sick elder was spoon-fed broth, or how a mother pressed her cheek to her child's fevered forehead. No declarations, just action. Affection was expressed through shared labor, hands working together to build shelter, to catch fish, to mend tools, a glance of recognition, a touch on the back. It was presence, again, not performance. Even jealousy appeared, a missed glance. A shift in sleeping arrangements, food not shared, these things mattered. The tribe was a web of feelings that had no names but deep weight. And then came birth, not fanfare, gravity. The entire world paused. The air shifted when a cry pierced it. Mothers gathered, not as midwives, but as keepers of something older than knowledge, instinct. One woman supporting the laboring mother. Another catching the child. Another wiping blood with practiced tenderness. Pain was not something to fear, it was honored. The body opening itself to life was sacred. Moments like these demanded more than memory. They needed marks, a red stripe on stone, a handprint by the cradle, a token placed in a grave. These were not decorations, they were witnesses, proof that something meaningful had happened. Gradually the sacred grew. It wasn't religion yet, but it was reverence. Trees were no longer just trees, they were ancestors standing still. Rivers remembered the dead. Fire was not just warmth, it listened. Fear gave birth to myth. A rustle at night became a spirit, a streak of lightning, a message, thunder, the anger of something unseen. And so they began to live with the invisible, not as fantasy, but as truth. The first gods weren't strangers, they were the dead who stayed close, the ones who walked through dreams and echoed in laughter. They were names spoken only when needed, shadows recognized, not feared, and with gods came conscience. They began to ask, how should we live? What is fair? Who do we protect? Even without commandments, they knew reverence, not because they feared judgment, but because they could feel when something was too important to break. They sang to the sky without lyrics. They knelt to rivers without doctrine. They placed offerings not to appease, but to remember. There were no sermons, but there was rhythm. Reverence didn't come from belief. It came from noticing how the stars returned every year, how the moon pulled the tide, how death always followed life, and life kept insisting anyway. They listened. Not to gods, but to the breath of the world. A sudden stillness in the bird song, the ache before the rain, the heat that lingered after the fire died. These were omens, not superstitions, but cues. They didn't fear the sacred, they carried it. In their rituals, in their pauses, in their quiet acts of care. They built no temples. Their temple was the moment something larger than them passed through, a death that silenced the tribe, a birth that filled it. A touch that stayed. And in that we recognize ourselves, in how we mourn, love, and mark what matters, in how we light candles, carve names, whisper to those who have passed, in how we stare at the sky and ask for meaning. They were not primitive. They were attuned, and their sacred lives on inside ours. There was no ceremony, no chants, no titles, no moment that told a child they had crossed into knowing. Instead, it was a quiet shift, barely noticeable, a glance held longer, a question left unasked. A step taken without being told. They didn't teach wisdom, they modeled it. You learned by watching someone who moved through the world like they belonged to it and respected it. There were no lectures about the right way to act. Only the soft correction of a raised eyebrow, a pause before picking a plant, a sigh before leaving a footprint. To be wise was not to know everything. It was to carry knowledge gently, to let it settle in your bones. The one who spoke least often held the most, because they waited to see if others could find the answer themselves. Waited to hear what the forest would say. Knowledge wasn't stored in scrolls. It was hidden in muscle memory, passed on through repetition, trust, and time. A child who helped gut a fish, who crushed berries for dye, who sat silently beside an elder tending a wound. They were being educated. The earth spoke in subtleties, the way birds went silent when danger lurked, the shift of clouds before snow, the feel of dry air just before a storm. This was not mystical, it was precise. What we might call gut instinct was really memory sharpened by 1,000 repetitions. In that world, the difference between wisdom and ignorance could mean life or death, picking the wrong route, crossing a frozen lake too early. Ignoring the hunger in someone's eyes. Survival meant attention, not only to nature, but to people. They read one another like they read the land. A slumped shoulder was a story. A sudden quiet was a question. Every person carried signals, and the wise didn't interrupt, they interpreted. Wisdom was slow, you couldn't speed it up. The young might run faster, but the old saw farther. And so the tribe moved at the pace of its oldest member, not out of pity, but because that's where memory walked. They taught through waiting. Letting the child fall and try again. Letting silence stretch until the real question surfaced. Letting conflict simmer just long enough to become understanding. The invisible wisdom wasn't only about what to do, it was about what not to do. Don't speak when someone is grieving. Don't harvest the same bush 2 days in a row. Don't shame. Don't rush. It was the art of restraint. Of knowing that sometimes the most powerful act is choosing not to act. Even correction had its rhythm. An elder might wait weeks to revisit a mistake, not out of negligence, but because truth lands best when someone is ready to receive it. There were no punishments, only consequences, and no rewards, just acknowledgement, a nod, a smile, a seat closer to the center. Status was earned not by dominance but by presence. Elders remembered not just events but feelings. Who had been kind during hunger, who had stepped forward during illness. Wisdom kept score, not for judgment but for balance, to know when it was someone's turn to rest. This was an education of the soul. Of learning not just what to notice, but how to care. Even the youngest learned their part, not through chores but through contribution. When a child picked up fallen kindling or rocked an infant while the mother rested, no one clapped, but someone always noticed. And so they grew, woven into a web of interdependence, not as individuals trying to stand out, but as threads holding one another in place. When one thread frayed, the others held stronger. That was the wisdom no one spoke aloud. That survival was not just a matter of skill, but of being willing to matter to one another. In our time, we confuse information with wisdom, but wisdom doesn't come from knowing more. It comes from needing less and noticing more, from slowing down enough to let the world speak back. Their world was not slower because they were primitive. It was slower because it was full of sound, movement, silence, signs. They had to be present, not because they were enlightened, but because it was the only way to live. And maybe if we could learn to see again, not just look, but truly see, we'd realize that the oldest wisdom still whispers, in pauses, in patterns, in the spaces between words. It's there, waiting, just like it always has. Why do you flinch when someone raises their voice? Why does your chest tighten when a conversation turns cold? Why does silence sometimes scream louder than words? These aren't quirks, they're signatures. Etched deep into your nervous system by people who lived long before you had a name. Tens of thousands of years ago, staying alert wasn't a personal quirk, it was a survival requirement. Every small change in tone, posture, or facial twitch signaled something: danger, rejection, or safety. Being attuned meant staying alive. If you missed a cue, you might miss your chance to eat, escape, or be protected. Today, your environment has changed, but your biology hasn't. That rush of adrenaline when someone forgets to respond to your text, that hollow sting when you're not included in a group outing, it's not your ego overreacting. It's your ancient brain recognizing a possible threat to your belonging. To our ancestors, isolation meant death. Exile wasn't poetic, it was literal. The fire, the food, the protection, they lived inside the group. So evolution crafted a nervous system that equated inclusion with safety. That wiring is still alive in you, in meetings, on social media, at school pickup. We are creatures who scan for signs of belonging, and when they're absent, our nervous system panics. But this isn't just about survival. It's about calibration. Human beings became the dominant species not because of brute strength, but because of their ability to collaborate, detect threat, and respond quickly and precisely. What we now call social anxiety was once situational genius. You check your appearance in a mirror not out of vanity, but because your ancient self knows that looking disheveled might mean rejection. You rehearse conversations in your head because your brain once needed to plan every word in a tight-knit group, where one wrong phrase could lead to banishment. These aren't flaws, they're echoes. Consider how often your mind compares you to others. It's not because modern life made us insecure. That mechanism was built in. In the wild, knowing who ran faster or hunted better could be the difference between life and loss. Today we measure through likes, salaries, or physiques, but the drive is the same. It's about reading the hierarchy and staying inside the circle. Even conflict follows the same script. When you feel threatened in an argument, when your voice rises and your logic disappears, that's not a lack of maturity. It's your limbic system shouting that you're under social threat. To lose standing is to lose access. And your body remembers that even if your calendar is filled with therapy sessions and self-affirmations, the digital world didn't invent tribalism. It simply gave it new costumes, fan groups, hashtags. Political camps, even brands. We still form camps and we still fear exclusion. The loneliness you feel when scrolling past a party you weren't invited to, it's not about missing fun. It's about the primitive alert that says, "You've been left behind." But here's the paradox. The same system that drives your vigilance also gives you empathy, your ability to sense tension in a room. To notice a flicker of discomfort on a loved one's face, that's the same ancient survival radar. We evolved not just to detect predators, but to care for each other. In fact, emotional pain activates the same brain regions as physical pain, because evolution didn't distinguish between a broken bone and a broken bond. Both made you vulnerable, both demanded attention. We are the inheritors of those pain maps, of those response systems, and for too long we've labeled them as disorders, flaws, neuroses. But what if they're maps, not of where we're broken, but where we come from? This doesn't mean we're trapped in biology. It means we're responsible for it, because unlike our ancestors, we can pause, we can reflect, we can name the instinct and choose not to follow it. You can feel the pull to prove your worth and still step back. You can hear the voice that says you're not enough and answer, I see you, but I'm not obeying. This is your inheritance, not just survival, but choice. Even your harshest inner voices once had a function. They warned, they prepared, they shielded, but now you get to ask if they're still helpful. And sometimes simply seeing them is enough to loosen their grip. You are not broken, you are wired. Wired for care, for fear, for longing, and for awakening. You carry the first humans, in your heartbeat, in your glance, in your recoil and your reach. You carry their grief, their courage, their desperation, their songs. But more than that, you carry a moment they never had, the freedom to rewrite the script. To pause, to breathe, to say, this pattern ends with me. The calendar says 2025. Your smartwatch vibrates to remind you to breathe. Your fridge can order groceries, but none of this has upgraded your nervous system. Not really. Beneath your habits, your preferences, your productivity apps, you are still, biologically, neurologically, almost identical to a Homo sapiens who stared into firelight 40,000 years ago, trying to interpret the silence of the tribe. You respond to rejection like exile. Your nervous system spikes when you're ignored, overlooked, or unfollowed. That's not insecurity, it's survival wiring. In a tribal past, exile meant death. Today, it just means someone left your message on read, but the body doesn't know the difference. That rush you feel before a meeting, that's cortisol doing the same job it did before a mammoth hunt. Heightening your senses, pumping your heart, preparing you for social scrutiny, the most dangerous predator of all. We think we're different because we wear suits instead of skins, because we click instead of carve. But the tension in your shoulders when your boss walks in, that's ancient. The ache in your chest when you're ghosted, also ancient. What you feel isn't weakness, it's your ancestry speaking up. Modern life masks it well, behind glass, passwords, light switches, but the drama is the same. We navigate a world built for convenience with a brain built for consequences. Every moment you compare yourself on social media. Every impulse to win, impress, belong, it all whispers from the same place. Will they keep me? Do I still belong? We didn't evolve for likes, but for looks. Real, physical glances across fires. We didn't evolve for DMs, but for shared burdens and unspoken stories. And this mismatch is not a malfunction, it's a mirror, a message. An ancient wisdom hidden in discomfort. When you feel alone in a crowd, your system is doing its job. When a raised eyebrow or missed call sends you spiraling. It's not because you're broken, it's because you're built to sense danger in distance. Our brains evolved in groups no bigger than a few dozen. Today, we scroll past thousands. We were never designed to process so many eyes without intimacy. Even success doesn't exempt us. You climb the ladder, win the prize, secure the corner office, and the nervous system still aches. Because it's not just about what you've done, but how connected you feel while doing it. Isolation in luxury is still isolation. What we call anxiety might just be adaptation misfiring. What we call burnout might be a primal scream for rhythm, for rest, for slowness. The symptoms of modern malaise are not mysterious, they're logical. They're the cost of ignoring the body's ancestral language. You can't medicate away evolution, but you can listen, translate, soften. Ask yourself, why does silence hurt? Why does praise feel like food? Why do we dream of tribes, villages, circles, even in our fantasies of the future? Because something in us remembers, not just the fires, but the presence. You are not modern because you wear wireless earbuds. You are modern when you realize you're not. When you begin to hold both truths, I live in this world, but I am made of another. That dual awareness, that's the evolution that matters. And in that awareness, strange things begin to change. You stop blaming yourself for exhaustion. You stop confusing online noise with connection. You begin to crave time outside. You begin to measure your days not in output, but in presence. Your friendships deepen, not because you talk more, but because you say less with more attention. You stop performing and start relating. You begin to listen with your whole body, not just your ears. Your mornings shift, not because you bought a new routine, but because you remembered what mornings used to mean: a slow wake, a scan for safety, shared plans around kindling. Your meals become sacred, not because you joined a new diet trend, but because you eat with others, not screens. The clink of bowls replaces the click of mice. Maybe, just maybe, you start to love yourself not as a project to fix, but as an echo of survival that made it this far. A body that remembers, a mind that endures. We carry the dreams of those who had no language. We feel the longing of ancestors who couldn't name it. Our pain isn't just personal, it's transgenerational, but so is our healing. To break the pattern, you don't need to escape the modern world. You just need to include the old one, speak its tongue, make space for its rituals, reclaim its pace, make dinner a circle, not a transaction. Let silence be part of conversation. Light a candle, not for mood, but memory. These gestures don't change your DNA, they remind it. You're saying, I haven't forgotten, I still know where I come from. Modernity gave us flight, medicine, art, abundance, but it also gave us disconnection, overstimulation, identity crises. We now live longer, but not always deeper. We touch more, but not always truly. The cost of progress is not just ecological, it's emotional. So maybe the next step of our evolution isn't innovation, it's integration. Not escape, but return. Return to rhythm. Return to reverence. Return to the campfire within. You don't need to become primitive. You just need to remember you still are. That under every suit, every screen, every scientific fact, you are the great-grandchild of silence, of storm, of story. You are a walking archive, a breathing myth, and if you slow down, really slow down, you might hear the whisper, you are not so modern, and that's why you're still alive. Before we part ways, I want to say thank you for listening, for feeling, and for remembering. This story wasn't built in a lab. It was gathered from long nights of reading, from fragments of studies, from quiet awe. From moments staring at the ceiling, wondering why we still dream of forests. It's not perfect, it's not comprehensive, but it's sincere. If something in this story touched something in you, consider staying. Subscribe, like, leave a comment. This isn't just a channel, it's a circle, and every voice in it matters. If you notice something we missed, an idea misrepresented, a detail off, please let us know. This was stitched together with care, but the thread is always open. Your insight can only make the tapestry stronger. Because what we're trying to build here isn't just content, it's connection, across time, across silence, across algorithms. And maybe, just maybe, if enough of us remember where we came from, we might begin to shape where we're going. So, until the next story, keep your fire close, let your pace be human. And never forget, you were never meant to do this alone.